So the title of this talk, when I originally gave it, is Seeing Red, Lawrence Saint and the Quest for Medieval Striated Ruby. But really, this is about glassmaking in Bryn Athyn. This is a picture of Lawrence Saint, my buddy. Bryn Athyn Cathedral, you all know what it looks like. This is where you are if you haven't figured that out yet. This is what the town looks like if you just wanted to condense it down. So Bryn Athyn, very small little town. And it's all here because of John Pitcairn. John Pitcairn, with some other founders in 1883, created the Pittsburgh plate glass. And his fortunes came from investments in the railroad and those other industries, oil, a little bit earlier. And he created this he found this little idyllic valley, and these buildings are now here. They're part of our National Historic Register. So we cut ahead to his son. John Pitcairn was in charge of building the Bryn Athyn Cathedral, and then he passed away, and his son Raymond took over the building process. And I'm sure you have heard little bits about this already. So one of the things we're going to focus on is this question about the windows for the cathedral. Who is going to do them? Raymond Pitcairn looked to Clement Heaton, and then also Charles Connick as people that may be doing the windows, and then ultimately he decided to go with Lawrence Saint and Winfred Hyatt. They were both craftsmen that were employed here at Bryn Athyn. As you heard from Michael's wonderful talk today, Raymond Pitcairn collected incredible examples of medieval glass to be used as working models for his craftsmen, and we will see those later today. And in looking about how to actually replicate this glass, he went and he consulted with Tiffany. Tiffany suggested a man named John Larson. This is a picture of Larson in 1916 with Winfred Hyatt. Larson was one of a family in a dynasty of glass blowers. His father, Axel Larson, at the top, was originally from Sweden, by way of England, came to America and worked at the Dorflinger factory in Pennsylvania. And Dorflinger calls themselves America's finest glass. 1852 to 1921, they were making glass for the White House. So this is some of the glass that they were working on. And Larson, because of his family background, he knew the secrets of the formulas for making glass. Eventually, John Larson set up his own factory in Glendale, New York, where he was producing blown glass shades for gas lamps and very elaborate decorative work. When Pitcairn asked him to start making glass for this project, he was asking Larson to make cylinders and sheets of just flat glass exclusively for their stained glass production. And that went on from 1916 to 1922. This little trickle of glass was coming out of Glendale, New York, and the program was just not progressing fast enough. So eventually, Raymond Pitcairn asked John Larson, what will it take for you to close your factory in Glendale and come down and work exclusively for me? So Larson really wasn't willing to give up his practice, but he said, what you're asking me to do, blow cylinders and spin out rondels, is not the highest level of glass blowing. And I think I can train some people to do it, maybe even from your own community. So that's what happened. Larson came down and set up a glass factory, and it became known as the Bryn Athyn Glass Factory, and they were in operation from 1922 to 1942. David Smith was an employee of Larson, who was also Swedish, and he came down and he kind of found a new home here in Bryn Athyn. So when Larson ultimately left the program, David Smith stayed on, and Ariel Gunther was a young man who had just graduated from the Bryn Athyn High School. Raymond Pitcairn approached him and said, if you would be willing to be trained to make glass, I can guarantee that you'll have a lifetime's worth of employment. So Ariel Gunther and David Smith, working together, blew glass in the rondel method, which you're all familiar with, and the muff method, which you may not be as familiar with. They were opening cylinders hot on the blowpipe. Later today, when you go up to Glencairn, Jason Klein will be doing a demonstration of this process, so you'll be able to see it. And during that time, Ariel Gunther and David Smith created all the glass for the Bryn Athyn Cathedral, as well as that enormous stockpile that you saw in Brianna's talk. This is one of the boxes that I saw particularly intriguing because it says, oh, you are not going to ask me for that. There we go. Rich reds, varied and interesting. So one of those curious boxes. Now, would you walk past this and not look in the box? So that's what I did. And within this box is these incredible examples of what we're now calling the Bryn Athyn striated ruby. And what is so special about this? Today, when you go to the Glencairn Museum, you'll have a chance to spend some time with Michael Cawthron in the treasury, and he will undoubtedly want to talk about the flight to Egypt from the Cathedral of Saint-Denis in Paris. So I'm just going to mention it, that you will see this. But pay attention to the beautiful red glass in the background, because it was the model for the glass that Raymond Pitcairn's craftsmen were striving after. So what is so special about medieval red glass? The coloring agent comes from copper, and because of that, it's somewhat fugitive. If you do a solid blow of copper ruby glass, it's very intense and opaque, and it ends up looking like this. It's only when you see the edge of it, excuse me, where it gets very thin, do you actually begin to see any transparency to the color. So the medieval craftsmen had to come up with a way to, or the glassblowers came up with a way to make it thin enough so that you could actually see the color through it. And they did that through applying an overlay or a flash. That is evident in the flight to Egypt. And when you look at cross-sections of the medieval glass, you can see here that half the body of the glass is a clear kind of pale green glass, and the other half of the glass is a streaky red. And this streaky red is different from the modern red flash glass that you might be familiar with today, because it's not a very, very thin layer. It's made up of many, many layers of glass. And it's interesting, the chart on the right-hand side of this image shows that in the 12th and 13th centuries at the top, and going into the 14th century beneath that, this flash layer took up half the body of the glass and had many micro layers of red in it. And then once you got to the 15th century and continuing to the modern period, you get what we think of as the modern flashed red, a micro thin layer on the top that we use to etch and abrade. So I put on my hard hat to go splunking in the basement of the medieval cathedral because there were all these pipes hanging down there. And I did a survey of their reds, and I found a piece that I was able to take a cross-section of to look at. And this is what the Bryn Athyn red looks like. Half the body of the glass is the pale green, and the other half of the body of the glass is these micro layers of red. So whatever they came up with, they were able to do it. So I began to consult, as Brianna did also, the Bryn Athyn formula records. These record books were just day books of what they were melting in the tanks. And these are dated 1916 to 1919, so presumably from the timeline, they were Larson's personal journals. They were transcribed a little bit later. This is a recipe for red, and this note said it's one of the best reds we've gotten so far. They had a problem with a lot of the reds overheating and going black, so they made many pots of black before they ultimately were able to make this red. So the person who really knew exactly how to make the red was Ariel Gunther. But either because the record is incomplete or Pitcairn told him, don't talk about the reds, there isn't a very good written record of how exactly they were doing the red process. And that's why my focus turned to Lawrence Saint. To give you a little bit of his background, Lawrence Saint went to the Pennsylvania Academy of the Fine Arts. He received the Crescent Traveling Fellowship, which enabled him to go to Europe. He did watercolor illustrations of stained glass that were in the collection of the Victoria and Albert Museum, and ultimately they were published in a book by Hugh Arnold, which in 1906, don't give the date exactly right, but that became sort of the tome of medieval glass. So when he went to meet Raymond Pitcairn, he heard this process was happening, he came up with a copy of Hugh Arnold's book, and Raymond Pitcairn said, because I'm sure he had many stained glass people wanting to come up and work on this project. Oh, I see you have Hugh Arnold's book there. And Lawrence Saint said, well, I ought to. I did all the illustrations in it. And because of that, he was hired on the spot, and he began to work on this project. So Lawrence Saint worked at the Bryn Athyn Cathedral from 1917 until 1928. Lawrence Saint was a Presbyterian. He was not a Swedenborg. And maybe because of that, he did not completely mesh with the community here. So during that time period, he only made he was here for 11 years, and he made 7 windows. that were in the cathedral. So this is one of them that you can see. It's this wonderful rose window. And one of the things that I like about it is it's the only window, you are not going to do this to me again. It's the only window that actually has sort of, they were using the medieval technique of those pins that go in to support the panels. So Lawrence Saint was quite the medievalist. This is his grisaille window that he created, and these are some angels and saints that are up on the top layer of the clerestory. After he worked here, he heard that the National Cathedral was being created. So in 1928, he went down to the National Cathedral, and he was able to secure a position there as the first head of the glass program. And he said, I've worked on the Bryn Athyn project, and I can also bring the secret of making medieval glass, because the National Cathedral should have that kind of glass, that quality of it. And the cathedral, he worked there from 28 until 36. And these are some of the windows that you can see at the National Cathedral. This is a photograph of Lawrence Saint's studio from the archives of the cathedral. You can see his workers and the boxes of glass in the background. He also had them blowing rondels and sheets. These were some of his painters. Here's Lawrence Saint comparing some of his glass to a sample of medieval glass with his little microscope on the counter. And these were the glass blowers that worked in his factory. One of the things that I found very interesting was all of those photos I found by going down to the archives of the National Cathedral in Washington, and I later discovered that these buildings are all still standing, and the miracle is they are only a quarter of a mile away from here, down Huntington Pike. So he was making all of his windows here in Bryn Athyn as well. So Saint's masterpiece was the great north transept rose window, which he created in 1932. Lawrence Saint passed away in 1961, but before that, he wrote The Romance of Stained Glass, which was his autobiography. And in it, he left this tantalizing little script. I gave to the Metropolitan Museum of Art 2 station wagon loads full of all kinds of stained glass materials, sheets of red and rondels, all of my glass formulas, about 1,300 of them, and all of my glass paint formulas. This was later reaccessioned with my approval to the Corning Museum of Glass. So what do? I go up to Corning and say, I'm looking for this material. Is there any chance I can see it? And Gail Bardhand, who is an amazing librarian there, said 2 things to me. Oh, I'm sorry to tell you that I think that that is some of the material that was lost in the big flood that we had in 1972. And in her next breath, she said, but coincidentally, I just happen to have a bibliography about Saint on my desk, because, and in it, it said that, the reason she had it was one of Saint's granddaughters had just come to visit them 2 weeks earlier. So I asked for 2 things, the bibliography and the email address of Saint's granddaughter, and then we began to correspond. So this mentions other places where there were stashes of Saint's glass, and one of them was at the Smithsonian. So I went down to the Smithsonian. The glass was transferred there from the National Cathedral in 1977, and it's just referred to as Collection 90. It's not in the Smithsonian proper, but in their quote-unquote attic, which is in Reston, Virginia. So it's the Silver Hill facility, which is the off-site storage of the National Museum of American History. And I went down with my good friend Tony Galander, and we went into the high security area with all of these boxes, which, as you remember, this is where they store the Ark of the Covenant. So that's there, along with Saint's glass. I went into this high security area, and this research assistant was assigned to work with me, and she said, I am really excited to show you these materials because as far back as our records go, no one has ever asked to see them. And another interesting aside, this is our only collection that's radioactive. I'm like, oh, okay. So this is what the Saint collection looks like. There are paired boxes. One of them has a formula, and the other has an actual sample of the glass. So I began to go through them, and this is what Saint's formulas look like. So I want you to pair this with the handwritten daybook from Larson and Gunther. So here's one that says, color expected red, color obtained black. There's this chart, what time we turned on the furnace, how much gas we used, our exact formula, how many sheets we made. They numbered each sheet that they made. When I finally did meet Lawrence Saint's grandchildren, they said everyone in the Saint family is obsessive compulsive. So I think that went all the way back to Lawrence, because he did a lot of documentation and research. So this was the tantalizing envelope that I saw. It said it would contain 1 piece of red, 1 piece of green-white, 1 piece of pale blue, 1 piece of slightly hot flesh. Ooh. No, you're not doing this. Get out of here. 1 piece of flesh and 1 piece of slightly brownish flesh. And I opened it up, and there were only 5 pieces of glass. All the colors were there except for the red. So then I went through all the other envelopes, and all of these said they would have red in it, and I opened them one after one, and every box the reds were missing. So the research assistant said, I don't know what to say. No one has ever asked for this collection before. It's supposed to have the red in it. I don't know what to tell you. You've come all the way down here. I feel terrible. And I said, this is great. It's going to make such a great story. Don't even worry about it. So here we are, empty envelopes after empty envelopes. So I went through all 29 boxes, and finally in the last 3 envelopes, happy me, I found some pieces of red, and these were the small pieces of, these little small pieces of red. So this is what the samples look like. And I can tell you that he was making red, and this sample was dated from 1929, which was only a year after he opened his factory, but I couldn't find the samples of the perfected red, which was 1936. Although I did find his complete red formula. So I had it written down. And this is what I learned. In order to make Saint's red, you needed a crucible, a furnace with 4 little pots. And one you would make a glass with yellow flowers of sulfur, and one you would make a glass with red copper scale. And you would make 2 batches of the green-white. And the yellow flowers of sulfur would look dark yellow. The red copper scale glass would look purple. When they melted them together, you would take pot 1 and pour it into pot 2 and stir it up, and it would miraculously turn green and be completely clear. And then you would do the flashing, and as you flashed the glass, it would strike in the kiln, and then you would see the red. So remember I talked to you about Saint's grandchildren? I'm going to fly through this. They came up, they were here, I showed them all kinds of cool stuff. They brought me a sample. And this was the only sample that they could give me of what Saint's actual red looked like. But they did give me this beautiful rondel, which they referred to as Grandpa's formula plates, and inscribed with a diamond, it said, Formulas at the Corning Museum of Glass. And this was Lawrence Saint Formula 869-1. So I went back to Corning, and I said, for God's sakes, you're the Corning Museum of Glass. You're telling me you had a flood, and if the glass got wet, you threw it out? That glass must be there. You cannot have lost this glass. So I go through the phone chain, and ultimately I get to the registrar, and he said, we have an off-site storage facility also. And there, I remember, up in the warehouse, there's a pallet that has some boxes that have been there since 1972 when we had the flood. And on the outside of them, it says Lawrence Saint. And if you come up, I'll open them up with you, because you'll probably be able to tell me what's in them. So it was at that moment that I became the Lawrence Saint expert. This is all you need to do, really, to become an expert. I hate to tell you, all of those of you that have gone off and got your master's and your PhDs, you don't have to do that. You just have to ask the questions and show up. So that's what I did. I asked the questions and showed up. I didn't mean that. But anyway, let me tell you quickly about the flood. So in 1972, Hurricane Agnes took an inward turn, and it collided with this low, mid-latitude cyclone thing, and it parked over Corning, and it rained and rained and rained. And this was a photo that the Corning Museum gave me, and it showed me the water level. This is how high the water got on the 2nd floor of the museum. The 1st floor of the museum was completely underwater. So it was a big mess. So these, the Saint materials made it through the flood. We opened them up. It said on the outside, Lawrence Saint formula and ingredients. And when I opened it up, I found a similar collection to what's in the Smithsonian, but also there were ingredients, little tiny, very enticing little ingredients. So, and when I opened up the envelopes, here they had packaged, or Saint had packaged his samples directly with the formula in one envelope. So this is what they look like. So these I pulled out and identified as the reds. They all said they would have red, and lo and behold, they had red. And you can see by the mud mark, I'm the first person that opened these up and brought these back to the light of day. So these are Saint's, all of Saint's reds, are up at Corning in their collection, including this little rondel. So one of the things that Saint said was all of his glass he blew out in rondels with the exception of the reds, because the reds looked like 4th of July pinwheels, and they were hard to incorporate into a design. So as we were going through the boxes, I found some, what? Don't do this to me, go away. So I found some pieces that were, they'd been through the flood, they looked like they were wrapped in paper mache. There were some round pieces wrapped in paper towel in kind of like a cocoon, and there were some rectangular sheets. So I said to the registrar, those rectangular pieces, those will be the Saints' Reds. Is there any chance you could open them up? So here's another trick I learned when you're doing research. He said, well, you know, all the conservators are away for the weekend, but I'll open them up for you. So he took them to the sink, and he soaked them in the water, and he opened them up, and here they were, and here were the Saints' Reds. So we were both really happy that day to have found the Saints' Reds. So, and interestingly enough, these have the same kind of markings on them as the panels in the basement of the cathedral. And I'll talk to you more about that because I'm running out of time. So I've run out of time, but you're graciously extending me a little bit because I'm the president and I'm just going to do whatever I want. Thank you. So quickly, some modern attempts. I went to the Lambert's factory. And you all know Lambert's, they're fantastic. They're one of our major sponsors. And I asked them if they could make some sheets of red. And they made some amazing pieces of glass. And these are on display on the second floor of the Deering Center so you can see them. But one of the limitations of the process that I have since discovered is they could match the color, but the scale of the sheets that Lambert's is working on, the intensity of the striations really gets spread out. So the glass that was made here in Bryn Athyn was small, about the size of a sheet of paper. And I believe from this that probably the medieval glass was also small, about the size of a sheet of paper. So I asked my friend Jason Klein, who does Middle Ages reenactment, if he would be willing to try to crack and make the reds. So we worked together and we made some red glass. And we tried, and we blew glass, and we tried all kinds of things, and we made some attempts. And this is where the glass kind of struck in the kiln. This is what it looked like if it were to fall off the blowpipe without actually going into the annealer. And what you see on the other side, those are pieces that we re-annealed, and the color would come up. So Jay ultimately made me some cylinders, and this is one of the pieces that I think is pretty spectacular, because he knocked it off, he put it into the annealer, and when it came out, this is what it looked like. So he continued to work. He gave me some cylinders that we opened up and flattened, and then these are some of his samples, and ultimately we created this. So the piece that you're seeing on the left-hand side is a fragment of medieval glass that was given to Raymond Pitcairn from Canterbury Cathedral with a little note saying, "Dear Mr. Pitcairn, I hope that this sample helps you in your quest to recreate the great glass of the Middle Ages." And the piece that you see on the right is a piece of Jason's glass. So we got very, very close to doing this. And this one, even better. So we've been working at this more and more. So I really wanted to make the actual formula, which is not what we were doing, but we didn't have access to a furnace that had all of these bits. So I met this guy, Rich Federici. He took me to his studio, and he happened to have this kind of formula. And just as we were on the cusp of doing it, the recession hit. His factory had to close, and we were not able to go. He went out of business. So ultimately, I had a chance to make a poster presentation about this at the Corpus Vitriorum in Lisbon, Portugal. And I went back to Jay and said, "Jay, I'm going to Lisbon. I'm going to be in front of all these crazy people who really love the medieval stuff. And is there any chance you would try again to make some more red?" So Jay made it at the New York Renaissance Festival in front of a crowd, you know, sort of live on the spot. And he blew and opened up some sheets of medieval red. And these were the pieces that they made when they brought them out of the annealer. And I put them in my suitcase, and I took them with all this stuff to Lisbon, to the Corpus Vitriorum, sat through the things, presented my poster, and then passed them around at dinner while we were all listening to fado music at this beautiful outdoor restaurant. I said, "By the way, let me show you my streaky medieval red that my friend Jason Klein is." So like a beautiful after-dinner suite, we passed these around the table, and everyone was like, "Oh my gosh, this is beautiful, beautiful stuff." So I met someone from Germany who took some of the, I had a small bit of Bryn Athyn glass that I was allowed to give to an expert that I might happen to meet. And he did some testing on the piece and made an analysis of the Bryn Athyn glass, and this is posted on a blog that I have. So this is available, free research for all of you to look at. I'll give you the address. And this is what he said. It's not exactly, it looks like medieval red, but it is not the same formula as medieval red. And then one day, I walked into the museum, and our collections manager came to me with this really sheepish like this. And he said, "Ken, I got something to tell you. I'm really afraid to even tell you this." And I said, "Brett, what is it?" And he said, "Remember all those years ago you asked me if we had any samples of Lawrence Saint's materials?" And I said, "I'm the collections manager. I can tell you honestly that we do not have anything." Well, he said, "I just happened to be up in the safe, and I found this box in the stained glass storage, and it says Lawrence Saint formulas and samples." And he said, I'm really hoping that this isn't the stuff that you went all the way to Corning to see and all the way to Washington to see." And I'm like, "Give me the box." So I took the box out of the museum, and I took it to my classroom, and I opened the box, and oh, it's not letting me go any further. So on that note, what I'm going to tell you is I opened the box, and I found Lawrence Saint samples. And we, Bryn Athyn College, or the Glencairn community, we have a collection of 800 samples of Lawrence Saints, along with the original formulas. And in preparation for this conference, I put a lot of all this stuff that you've seen into the display cases on the second floor of the Deering Center, which you will be able to go and see whenever you like. Just stroll by, and I will open the case for you. I will let you handle the medieval piece. I will let you handle Jason's pieces. I will let you handle the Lawrence Saints pieces and the Bryn Athyn glass. So thank you for coming, and thank you for giving me your extra time.